अस्सलाम वालेकुम, मैं हूं ओवैस मंगलवाला और आप देख रहे हैं वर्ल्ड वाइड, दुनिया को देखने का, जांचने का, परखने का एक अलग जाविया। एक केस ऐसा है, एक जुर्म की सज़ा कितनी बड़ी हो सकती है, और जुर्म भी ऐसा कि जिसके मुताल्लिक कई शकूक व शुबात मौजूद हों। फिर दुनिया की हर अदालत का तरीक़ाकार ये होता है कि वो मुल्ज़िम को अपनी सफाई का मौका देती है और बुनियादी हुकूक फराहम करती है, लेकिन एक केस में ऐसा बिल्कुल भी नहीं हुआ। उस केस में मुल्जिम पर इल्ज़ाम ऐसे आयद किए गए कि जिनका न सर था न पैर था, और फिर उस मुल्जिम को कानूनी जंग लड़ने की भी इजाज़त नहीं दी गई। ये केस अमेरिका में था और ये केस था आफिया सिद्दीकी का। हुकूमत पाकिस्तान ने सिफारती सतह पर कई बार कोशिशें की, लेकिन कुछ हमारी गलतियां और कुछ अमेरिका की हठधर्मी आफिया सिद्दीकी को आज तक रिहाई न मिल सकी। अब आपकी मुलाकात करवाते हैं आफिया सिद्दीकी केस के एक बड़े अहम किरदार से, और ये किरदार हैं आफिया सिद्दीकी की बहन फौजिया सिद्दीकी साहिबा। फौजिया सिद्दीकी साहिबा ने एक मुहिम का आगाज़ किया, और ये मुहिम है बुनियादी तौर पर कि हम सब पाकिस्तानी जो हैं वो ख़त लिखें अमरीकी हुकूमत को, और उससे उनका कहना यह है कि बहुत ज़्यादा असर पड़ेगा आफिया सिद्दीकी की रिहाई के लिए, ये बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पैक्टफुल साबित होगा। फौजिया सिद्दीकी साहिबा हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं, उनसे बात करते हैं। अस्सलाम वालेकुम फौजिया साहिबा।
वालेकुम अस्सलाम, अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह।
फौजिया साहिबा, बहुत शुक्रिया आपका, प्रोग्राम के लिए आपने वक्त निकाला। सबसे पहले तो मैं आपसे ये जानना चाहूँगा कि ये जो मुहिम थी कि जिसमें आपने आवाम से अपील की थी कि वो अमरीकी हुकूमत को लिखें और इस हवाले से आफिया सिद्दीकी के हवाले से अपनी आवाज़ उठाएं और उसका बड़ा इम्पैक्ट होगा अमरीकी हुकूमत पर, मुझे बताएं ये मुहिम जो है वो कहाँ तक पहुँची है, कितने ख़त अब तक भेजे जा चुके हैं, क्या सूरत हाल है?
Um, honestly, I was really humbled, and the experience was so uplifting कि मैं आपको बता नहीं सकती कि ये पूरी पाकिस्तानी अवाम ने जिस तरह से इस कैंपेन में शिरकत की है, एंड दिस वाज कंप्लीटली नॉन पॉलिटिकल, जस्ट सिर्फ अपनी बहन की। इसमें एक दिस वाज अ ह्यूमैनिटेरियन अपील, एंड लोगों ने जिस तरह से रिस्पांस दिया है, लेटर्स टू द व्हाइट हाउस, टू पार्डन अटर्नी, उनके पूरे, हमारा गोल ये था कि उनकी जो ईमेल्स हैं वो मैक्स आउट हो जाए और वो रिटर्न होने, एंड वी अचीव दैट गोल विद इन अ वीक। फिर जैसे ही खाली होती गई वो और जाते गए, एंड इवन टिल नाउ लाखों लोगों के लेटर्स मौजूद हैं, एंड दैट हैज नॉक्ड, जाहिर है किसी के जब वो जब भी खोले, एंड मैं इसमें अपनी सोशल मीडिया टीम को भी बहुत ज़्यादा आई एम अमेज्ड कि दिन रात लग के उन्होंने किस तरह लिंक्स बनाए और हर बार उसको चेंज करते रहे कि स्पैम नहीं हो, एंड द पार्टनर अटर्नी फाइनली इट दे नोटिस्ड इट, वी वर नोटिस्ड, एंड दैट इज व्हाट वी नीडेड। पाकिस्तानी बहुत साथ, और मैं बहुत एहसानमंद हूँ।
अच्छा, और एक ख़त जो है वो पाकिस्तान की तरफ से भी लिखा गया था अमेरिकी हुकूमत को, शहबाज शरीफ साहब ने ये ख़त भिजवाया था, तो मुझे बताएं कि उस ख़त के हवाले से क्या हुआ, क्योंकि उस ख़त की वजह से भी एक उम्मीद जागी थी कि आफिया सिद्दीकी की रिहाई की तरफ हम कुछ आगे बढ़ेंगे, तो वो मामला कहाँ तक पहुँचा?
दिस इज द मिलियन डॉलर क्वेश्चन जो अभी आपने किया, कि अक्टूबर में वो खत लिखा था, क्या वो सदर बाइडेन से अभी के नहीं, या जिस तरह डेलीगेशन गई तो एम्बेसडर गायब हो गए और एम्बेसी का कोई किरदार नजर नहीं आया, तो क्या सदर साहब ने एम्बेसी को भेजा तो एम्बेसडर अपनी एक फाइल के अंदर रखे और उस खत को बैठे हुए हैं, उन्होंने आगे फॉरवर्ड ही नहीं किया, क्योंकि ये डिप्लोमेटिक प्रोटोकॉल है कि अगर कोई चीफ एग्जीक्यूटिव लेटर जा रहा है तो उसका जवाब जरूर आता है, उसकी रिसीविंग आती है। लेकिन मैं एक खत भेजती हूँ, मैंने चीफ ऑफ आर्मी स्टाफ को इनको लेटर्स दिए, मैं जब गई उनको देने के लिए तो मुझे भी उन्होंने रिसीविंग दी, अलग बात है अगले दिन कहा के आके ले जाओ, बट रिसीविंग दी, मेरे जैसों को भी दी, तो सोचे चीफ एग्जीक्यूटिव को रिसीविंग नहीं मिलेगी। एंड ये भी बताया जाता है तो डिप्लोमेटिक प्रोटोकॉल्स होते हैं, तो व्हाट हैपेंड इन बिटवीन, दैट इज द मिलियन डॉलर क्वेश्चन।
اچھا، یہ جو دونوں ممالک کے سفارتی معاملات ہیں، ظاہر ہے ہمارا تو یہ خیال ہے کہ سفارتی سطح پر ہی اس کیس کا کوئی نہ کوئی حل نکلے گا، تو دونوں ممالک کے سفارتی حوالے سے ذرا مجھے اگر آپ بتا سکیں کہ ہرڈلز کہاں پر ہیں؟
جو ایک مشہور مصرع ہے کہ مجھے رہزنوں سے نہیں ہے گلا، مجھے تو اپنوں کی رہبری کا سوال. عافیہ از اے پاکستانی سٹیزن. قصور پاکستان سے ہوا. They are the ones they need to clean up their mess. And they need to walk their talk. تو یہ ان کا چیف ایگزیکٹو نے تو لیٹر لکھ دیا اور بہت اچھا لیٹر لکھا، لیکن اس کا فالو اپ کون دے گا؟ وہ میکینزم کہاں ہے؟ یہ ڈیلیگیشن جانی تھی جس نے اس کا فالو اپ لینا تھا. انفارچونیٹلی اس میں کوئی ایسا نمائندہ ہی نہیں تھا وزیر اعظم کا جو اس کا فالو اپ لے.
آپ کی اس مہم میں اس وقت آپ کو گورنمنٹ کی سپورٹ حاصل ہے، اور اگر ہے تو کس طرح کی سپورٹ ہے؟
لیکن میں صرف دو چیزیں کہہ سکتی جو اس میں نے ایکسپیرینس کیا کہ اگر تمام ادارے اسی طرح فنکشن کر رہے ہیں جس طرح ہماری وزارت خارجہ کر رہی ہے نا، واقعی میں ہم ریورس گیئر میں اسی لیے چل رہے ہیں اور ساری دنیا ترقیوں کے لیے آگے جا رہی ہے اور ہم مقروض سے مقروض تر ہوتی جا رہے ہیں. I mean, it's disappointing. یا تو بالکل نااہل ہے یا پھر they have no will to do it. تو دونوں طرح سے I mean, it's a shame. دونوں صورتوں میں I mean, جس طریقے سے انہوں نے اس ڈیلیگیشن کو ڈیریل کرنا چاہے، میرے جانے کو ڈیریل کیا ہے، اور جو یہ تو وزارت یہ this was the bureaucracy that did this. تو I don't know، یہ ملک ہماری جو پرابلمز ہو رہی ہیں نا، اب سمجھ میں آتا ہے کہ یہ پرابلمز کیوں ہیں. It's not the people.
اچھا، اگر اوورال ہم دیکھیں تو پاکستان کی کس سیاسی جماعت یا کن سیاسی جماعتوں نے اس پوری صورتحال میں عافیہ صدیقی صاحبہ کے کیس پہ آپ کی سب سے زیادہ مدد کی ہے؟ اور اگر ہم سیاسی رہنماؤں کی بات کریں تو کس سیاسی رہنما نے اور کن سیاسی رہنماؤں نے اس حوالے سے آپ کو سب سے زیادہ سپورٹ کیا اور سب سے زیادہ مدد کی ہے؟
آپ اس وقت دیکھیے، آپ سارا دیکھیے، 20 ملین سے زیادہ ہماری ریچ کراس کر گئی ہے سوشل میڈیا پہ. But there was not a single political leaders called ہمارے اس پہ. These were the citizens of Pakistan, people of Pakistan. یہ دلوں کی بات، یہ سیاست نہیں.
اور فائنلی فوزیہ صاحبہ یہ بھی بتائیے گا کہ ظاہر آپ اتنے عرصے سے اپنی بہن کی رہائی کے لیے جد و جہد کر رہی ہیں، اور یہ بہت مشکل مرحلہ ہے آپ کے لیے، سب کے لیے. کتنا قریب ہیں آپ کو کیا لگتا ہے کتنا قریب ہیں آپ عافیہ صدیقی کی رہائی کے حوالے سے؟
میں تو ممکن ہوتا تو پرسوں کی جو لسٹ تھی اس میں عافیہ کا نام ہونا تھا، مگر شاید اللہ کو منظور نہیں تھا. ابھی شاید اللہ کو یہی منظور تھا کہ میں خود جا کر لے کے آؤں، تو وہ راستہ بند کر دیا. لیکن اللہ کی ذات سے نا امید تو کافر ہوتا. میں تو کہیں سے بھی نا امید نہیں ہوں. اینڈ آئی ویری شیور کہ انشاءاللہ جو اتنا ایفرٹ ڈالا ہے، the millions of people جنہوں نے یہ کیا ہے، اللہ تعالیٰ رائے گا نہیں کرتا. Nothing happens without a purpose. پتا بھی نہیں ہلتا اس کے بعد. And that is my faith. انشاءاللہ there are still more to come. There is still time. پورا مہینہ ہے ابھی، 30 days میں تو بہت کچھ ہو جاتا ہے. آپ سیریا کو دیکھیں 3 دن کے اندر کیا سے کیا ہو گیا.
بہت شکریہ ادا کریں گے. فوزیہ صدیقی صاحبہ ہمارے ساتھ موجود تھیں. فوزیہ صاحبہ، دعائیں آپ کے لیے کہ اللہ تعالیٰ آپ کی مشکلات کو آسان کرے اور عافیہ صدیقی صاحبہ کی بھی مشکلات کو آسان کرے. پروگرام میں لینا ایک چھوٹا سا وقفے کے بعد آپ سے دوبارہ ملاقات کرتے ہیں. یہ ہے ورلڈ وائز، ہمارے ساتھ رہیے گا. ویلکم بیک. بریک کے بعد ایک مرتبہ پھر آپ کو ورلڈ وائز میں خوش آمدید کہتے ہیں، اور اب عافیہ صدیقی کی قانونی جنگ جاننے کے لیے ہمارے ساتھ امریکہ سے موجود ہیں عافیہ صدیقی کے وکیل Clive Stafford Smith. Clive Stafford Smith is the famous lawyer who's representing Aafia Siddiqui and fighting the legal battle for her release. Hello, Clive. Welcome to the show. Let's start the show with your organization, the Justice League. What is Justice League and what exactly does it do?
Well, look, because I'm now so old and decrepit, I figure I've got far enough that I should be teaching the next generation of human rights advocates. So I left Reprieve, which I had founded some time ago. And the Justice League is about getting volunteers and apprentices and helping them learn both, how to do this sort of work and how to create a job that allows them to do it for the next 40 years, like I have.
Okay, so it's completely different from Retrieve, this Justice League that you found?
Yeah, it's totally separate. I mean, one reason I left Reprieve was if you're in an organization that's got that big, and Reprieve was 35 people by then, it's very hard to do the work right on the front line in the trenches. Because when I go to Afghanistan, for example, for Aafia, I don't have insurance, I don't have security, I don't have anything like that. Because you just can't get it. So that means if you're in a bigger organization, you just can't do the work I want to do. I'm still very much doing the same sort of thing, but I'm doing it much more with a focus on training the next generation.
Okay, so are you able to find some good volunteers? What is the quality of those youngsters?
Oh yeah, it's great. I think the future will be secure if we get them to do the job. And if we get them to stop the madness that goes on in the world, like there's efforts to change your constitution right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's start with your work related to Afia Siddiqui. I was watching a recent podcast of yours where you called her the prisoner of prisoners. Why this terminology and what does this terminology tell us about her?
Well, I have represented a lot of people in Guantanamo and even more in other black sites around the world. And some of the things you learn in that are really horrific. Some of the men I've represented, Benyam Mohammed was taken to Morocco where they took a razor blade to his genitals, for goodness sake. But the thing that sets Aafia apart is quite apart from the fact that she's really the only woman who's gone through this whole rendition to torture nonsense. The real issue is that when she was abducted in Karachi, her 3 children were abducted with her. And the youngest, Suleiman, 6 months, was apparently dropped on his head and killed, but no one's ever had the courage to admit that and put the family out of their misery. The second child, Mariam, was taken to Afghanistan, where she was forcibly adopted into a white Christian American family on the principle, apparently, that that's better than being a Pakistani Muslim of color. And then the third child, Ahmed, age 6, a United States citizen, for goodness sake, was taken by the CIA to Kabul, where he was put in prison for 5 years. I mean, these people are just mad. And of course, if you think, and you don't have to be a parent to understand this, but I know all parents out there will, as I do, the idea of abducting your children is just exponentially worse than abusing yourself.
So that's yes, a very important point. So with this point, can we ask you that people who are not Americans, do they have any human rights?
Well, they should. And it's been my job, given the mad things that the US government and others, the British and everyone else, and the Pakistanis for that matter, it's my job to try to enforce those. You have to realize that everyone was in cahoots on this. I mean, it was President Bashar who said in his book that he was the one who sold more than half of the prisoners to the Americans for bounties. So there were a lot of bad things going on. But our job is not just to stand there and whine and complain. Our job is to set those things straight. And I'm grateful to you for doing that on your program today.
You are actually doing the job. We're just trying to bring this whole issue in front of the people. And in that podcast that I was watching, you also mentioned that 99%, in fact, more than 99% of the people who were detained at Guantanamo Bay, they were declared safe by US authorities later.
It is pretty shocking that in order to get a prisoner out of Guantanamo Bay, we had to satisfy the top 6 US intelligence agencies that they were no threat to anyone. Now, you remember at the beginning of all this, Donald Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense, said these were the worst of the worst terrorists in the world on the battlefield, right? That turns out to be total nonsense. And I brought the first case against Gitmo in 2002, February the 19th. And when we finally got the right to go in there from the US Supreme Court, thanks to the constitutions, then, I was looking for people who were honest to good terrorists, and I was having a terrible time finding any. And in the end, we have got 750 of the 780 prisoners out. A further 18 really have been declared not to be any threat and subject to release. So that's 768 out of 780 have been declared effectively innocent by the Americans themselves. That's really shocking. And I wonder what you would feel like if you got on Pakistan Airlines and they said, well, the chances of this flight reaching its destination less than 1%. You wouldn't fly on that.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So what were these people doing at Guantanamo Bay? And it seems that this whole Guantanamo Bay thing is a useless exercise.
Well, of course, it's a useless exercise. It was designed just to satisfy the Americans that somehow we were doing something about the so-called war on terror. But in fact, what we were doing was exactly the opposite. Because when we become hypocrites, when we say, well, the Constitution is just for us, it's not for those Muslim people, then the root of most hatred is this sort of hypocrisy. It's a yeast that ferments hatred. And I'm afraid when you look at what we did, Abu Ghraib, the Iraq War, the Guantanamo, torture, rendition, all this stuff, drone strikes in Waziristan, that did nothing to make the world a safer place. What it did was it annoyed a huge number of people and created many more people who want to do America harm. So it's not just that it didn't do anything positive. It was a catalyst for extremely negative things.
Absolutely. So you mentioned Donald Rumsfeld's nonsense. So what's the nonsense, or let me put another word. What are the loopholes in the American story of Aafia Siddiqui?
Well, it's what you see a lot in Pakistan, and really the government needs to get its act together and put an end to it. What you see is people being abducted. You see people being held without trial. You see the Constitution being thrown out. This was true of America, as it is true of the disappeared people in Pakistan. And, who's behind this nonsense, right? I mean, what mad person thinks that this is a way to make the world a more civilized and decent place? It's just crazy. And so with Aafia, one of the reasons we have all these legal rights that I'm there to defend is because the government makes terrible mistakes. They always do. They always have. And the individual who is powerless against the super powerful government needs help from the legal rights. Now, if you take those legal rights away, the government gets to walk all over you and make these mistakes. And Guantanamo is one of the fabulous social science studies of how bad the government's intelligence is and what terrible mistakes they make. If you get it wrong 99% of the time, I know of nothing else in the history of humanity where we get it wrong 99% of the time. So that's why we need, lawyers in the media and power for the powerless. And Aafia was a victim of that, and a victim in the most shocking way.
So what false claims are being made by the U.S. government about her, and what is the U.S. version of her story? Because you also mentioned in your podcast that she's been charged with nothing.
No, she's been charged with no terrorism. For years, they thought she was the ghost lady of Al Qaeda or some stupid phrase like that. And, the proof of the pudding, of course, is that they never charged her with anything like that because that was all nonsense. And I won't go through it all for you. I'd love to, but I've just filed a clemency petition with President Biden that is now 77,000 words long. So that's a book. Disabusing everyone of all the different things they said about Aafia. And it's not just in the past. If you look at your newspapers in the last week, your Prime Minister, Shahbaz Sharif, wrote a good letter on behalf of Aafia, and I'm grateful for that. But then the newspapers published all this total nonsense. They said, oh, yeah, he wrote a letter, but this woman is an Al-Qaeda terrorist and she's been locked up for all of these things and she was convicted of trying to kill someone. You know, look, I've been there now. No one went to Afghanistan to effectively investigate what Aafia was charged with before I went there. Well, part of that was because it was a war, of course. But she was convicted of attempted murder of 2 officials, 2 soldiers.
Yeah.
When she was the only person who got shot. And we're in a war zone where 100,000 people actually got killed. And somehow Aafia is the only person who ends up in prison for shooting someone, which she patently didn't do. And the greatest bit of evidence was there was pictures of 2 holes in the wall where she was meant to have shot at these soldiers. And the US military couldn't come up with any bullets. And it turned out there was a good reason for that. Those 2 holes were caught in a video earlier that day before the events ever happened. They were already there. They were actually holes for hanging pictures. And yet Aafia ended up in prison for 86 years for that. It is just unalterable nonsense.
And 86 years, isn't that a bit too much for such a crime?
Of course it is. I mean, when you think about it, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is the guy who in theory was behind 9/11, responsible for 2,977 murders, he's going to end up getting a lesser sentence in prison in the end than Aafia Siddiqui. And Aafia is meant to die in FMC Caswell, which is probably the most horrible prison I've ever been to. Believe you me, I've been to every death row in America almost, and I've been to Guantanamo 42 times. FMC Caswell is worse than all of those. And poor Aafia is in that place and she's meant to die there. This is just another example of how wrong the government gets it.
Clive, I'm going to stop you here. We'll take a very short break. एक छोटा सा वक्फा लेते हैं और वक्फे के बाद दोबारा आपकी खिदमत में हाजिर होंगे और गुफ्तगू यहीं से जारी करेंगे. मिलते हैं एक छोटे से ब्रेक के बाद. वेलकम बैक. ब्रेक के बाद एक मरतबा फिर वर्ल्ड वाइज में खुशामदीद. हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं क्लाइव स्टैफर्ड स्मिथ, वकील जो कि आफिया सिद्दीकी की रिहाई का केस लड़ रहे हैं. क्लाइव, व्हेन वाज द लास्ट टाइम यू मेट आफिया सिद्दीकी?
I saw her about 4 weeks ago. I've seen her 12 times in the last year, and it is a very disturbing thing to go see her because she's so traumatized, poor woman. I mean, if you can just imagine what happened to her kids happening to your kids, then you're tortured for 5 years. While you're being tortured in Bagram Air Force Base, they show you children being abused in front of you who you're meant to think are your children. Then after those 5 years, they pretend to let you go, but actually they're just trying to, quote, dispose of you. And they tried to kill her in Ghazni. And then they take her to this prison where she's been raped to us and sexually abused all the time. You know, can you imagine? It's a tribute to her that she's still in a bit of one piece. I mean, very, very much suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, but she's still there.
So what is her mental condition and her physical condition right now?
But the problem with her physical condition is in order to get basic health care, you know, she's missing a bunch of her teeth on top and bottom. To get basic dental care, she has to go through a process where they strip her naked and they make her go through a strip search and then they take her up to have x-rays and then they do nothing. This happened 2 years ago. They still haven't fixed her teeth. She's deaf in one ear because of where she got beaten in Bagram. They've done nothing for that. She's got a series of other problems, anemia and nutritional disorders from not getting proper food. They do nothing for that. That's the physical side of it. And just imagine, if you would, before you're allowed to go to see a doctor there in Pakistan, you have to agree to be stripped naked in front of a whole bunch of other people on video camera. You know, how would you feel? But then you take the trauma, the psychological trauma she's gone through. You can't get therapy for being tortured from the people who tortured you. You know, that much is pretty obvious. So she's not getting any help on that. So her life is just endless abuse and torture. And that's why we've got to get her out of there. There's no two ways about it.
And what about her 2 kids that are alive?
Well, maybe all 3 kids were alive. I always thought, you know, Suleiman must have died. But when you discovered that they forcibly adopted Mariam into a white family And she only got, look, Fowzia, a fabulous sister, only got Mariam back 7 years later. It's entirely possible that Suleiman is, in some place he's just had his 21st birthday and he's in New Jersey or somewhere. Who knows? The US government did apparently abduct effectively 1,250 Afghan children without anyone's permission when they were leaving Afghanistan. So, maybe Suleiman's with them. And I suppose I'd ask you this. Would you rather have closure and know your child is dead, or would you rather live in this, dark area thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll find them? So that's Suleiman. The other two, thanks to Fowzia, are really doing very well. Ahmed is a qualified doctor, and Mariam is about to become a doctor. She wants to be a doctor so she can help her mother when her mother gets out.
Coming to the prospects of her release, are there any prospects?
Oh, yeah, of course. After the US election, there are 10 weeks before January the 20th when the new president gets sworn in. In those 10 weeks, Joe Biden can do anything, right? He's still president, but he's got no political future. So he can do whatever is just. Now, our challenge is to get him to pay attention to Aafia's situation.
Mm-hmm. And one question that comes to my mind is, why would the Americans release her?
Well, there are two reasons why they should. One is what they've done is manifestly wrong. And the reason Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is going to get something less than the death penalty is because we tortured him. And the US has recognized that much at least should be a mitigating circumstance for his sentence. The same is obviously true for Aafia. But the second reason they should release her, quite apart from it just being the right thing to do, is Pakistan has to offer something. Donald Trump wrote a dreadful book called The Art of the Deal. But everything is a deal, right?
Yeah.
And your government's duty is to come up with a deal that the Americans want. And the obvious answer is Dr. Shakil Afridi, the guy who apparently helped the US kill bin Laden. The Americans want him. The Pakistanis want Aafia. So let's have a prisoner swap. And, certain people among your government have said, well, how can we do this? How can we send a Pakistani Dr. Afridi to America? Well, let me tell you, you sent Aafia to America. President Musharraf sold Aafia to the Americans. So there's absolutely no argument that Pakistan can't swap Dr. Shakil Afridi, who wants to go there, send him to America with his family.
Okay, and has there at any point in time in history been a merciful approach or some sort of an inclination by the US authorities for such a prisoner swap or for the release of Aafia?
Well, in Aafia's case, we haven't yet, but we're going to, I hope. But they do it all the time. I mean, look, whenever you read about an American person being wrongly arrested as a spy or whatever by Vladimir Putin, you hear about them doing swaps. We do it time. And it happened in Afghanistan a whole lot. We swapped the Taliban flight for the American prisoner that was being held by the Taliban. So it happens all the time. And the Pakistan government just needs to get to the program and do what's right.
Okay, so this letter is something that would work. That could be the first step after such a long time.
Yeah, it's a step. It's not the first step. I mean, I filed the clemency petition. We filed a compelling argument for her to get clemency. But it is a step, and we have to act urgently because there's very little time to make this happen. Now, I can't promise it's going to work. I hope it does, but I can't promise it. But if it doesn't, then we've got Plan B and Plan C, and those are possible too. And I'm not going to stop until we get this poor woman out of that.
Okay, and can you mention any mistakes that Pakistan has made in the past as far as the efforts of Aafia's release go?
I mean, where do we begin? I can't think of many Pakistan's got right so far. Now, I hope they are now, so, don't let me overly critical. But actually, what happened was they appointed counsel at the beginning who really didn't do what needed to be done here. Not entirely their fault, given there was a war going on. But since then, Pakistan simply hasn't put enough effort into it. They haven't, come up with a prisoner swap. If they don't like Shakil Afridi, then it's on them to come up with something else. And they haven't done all the things that they should have done to support her in prison. I've just sued the prison after 20 years of her being abused. The prison gets sued because they're abusing her. They won't let her have an imam. They won't let her have an independent doctor. All of these things are things that the Pakistan government should have been doing actively. But let's not look backwards. Let's look forwards, and let's look at the solution now instead of just criticizing.
And looking forward, it has to be a legal plus a diplomatic solution.
Well, yeah, both. I mean, it's really a matter of power. Everything comes down to power. If you're a powerless person in prison being abused, having 230 million Pakistanis on your side is really important, no matter what people say. But it also comes down to power in terms of other ways. I can't swap anyone for Aafia. I don't have someone to swap. Pakistan can. So it definitely is both political and legal. But the politics and the media are actually more important than the legal.
So what can these 230 million people of Pakistan do?
Well, I'll give you the address of President Biden in the White House. It's 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20500. You write to Biden, but you can do it online. You can go to the portal at the White House. You write to him saying, let Aafia go. Do it nicely. Let's not do it in an ugly way. Same thing. You can hold a protest outside the U.S. embassy or the U.S. consulate and deliver letters to President Biden, to the consular officials, because they'll then get them to him. At the same time, we need to get powerful people in America, Pakistani Americans who have clout, to contact both the senators and the president. We just need everyone to do their piece. And seriously, people who don't do their piece are not doing the right thing. You really need to do it.
That's very important. And finally, on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10, how hopeful are you? Which number would you give for a chance of release?
I'm always on a 10, and only because I have won over the years 98% of the cases I've done. Now, sometimes it's much harder than other times, but the truth is we're just not going to stop until we get her out. Will I promise to get her out by January the 20th? No. I really hope we do. But if that doesn't work, we'll do it another way.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you for your time. ये था हमारा खुसूसी इंटरव्यू जनाब क्लाइव स्टैफर्ड स्मिथ से, जो कि आफिया सिद्दीकी के लॉयर हैं और आफिया सिद्दीकी की रिहाई की कानूनी जंग लड़ रहे हैं। नाज़रीन, आज के प्रोग्राम में इतना ही। आपसे अगले प्रोग्राम तक के लिए हमें इजाज़त चाहिए। आपसे मुलाकात करेंगे अगले प्रोग्राम में। अल्लाह हाफ़िज़।